It was a sunny day when William, a wealthy tourist from a distant country, arrived in the city, filled with excitement and curiosity. He had heard so much about the ancient royal palace, its beautiful architecture, and its rich history. To him, it was just another attraction to check off his travel list. William was used to luxury, expensive hotels, fine dining, and private tours. He was always treated like a VIP wherever he went, and he expected nothing less during his visit to this foreign land. Walking through the cobbled streets, he admired the palaces and monuments that stood tall, each one telling stories of kings and queens from a time long past. Yet there was something about the royal guards standing at attention outside the palace that caught his eye. They were dressed in their traditional uniforms, standing completely still, without a single movement, no matter how many tourists gathered around them. William, however, was not impressed. He didn't understand the deep respect and discipline they commanded. He thought it was all just a show, a simple tradition to keep the tourists entertained. He stopped in front of one of the guards, his eyes scanning the soldier's stiff posture. William's smile grew wider as a thought crossed his mind. To him, this was just another opportunity to prove how much he could get away with. The guard stood motionless, his eyes fixed forward, completely indifferent to the passing crowd. But William didn't see the guard's discipline, honor, or strength. Instead, he saw an opportunity to have some fun, something he'd later regret deeply. He chuckled to himself as he reached into his bag and pulled out a small can of paint. It was a bright color, something that would stand out against the soldier's uniform. Without a second thought, he stepped closer to the guard. His heart raced with excitement as he poured the paint onto the soldier's shoes, slowly letting the bright streak of color spread across the polished leather. William thought it was hilarious. In his mind, this was just another silly prank, something that would be forgotten in moments. The guard didn't flinch. His face remained stoic, his eyes still fixed ahead, but William couldn't help but laugh. He stepped back, feeling the sense of victory. He had just done something that no one else would dare to do. As the laughter echoed through the crowd of tourists, none of them dared to intervene, too amused by the rich man's antics. William stood there for a moment, enjoying the attention, unaware of the trouble he was about to cause. His mind was still on the joke, convinced that nothing bad would come of it. But he didn't know that this wasn't just a random prank. It was a mistake that would change the course of his life. What William didn't understand was the deep sense of duty and respect that the royal guards embodied. For them, their uniforms weren't just clothes. They were a symbol of their commitment to their country, their king, and the people they protected. The paint, though small and seemingly harmless, was an insult to everything they stood for. Yet, in that moment, William felt like he had done nothing wrong. He was a rich tourist, after all. Money and status had always solved his problems before. How could this little prank cause any real trouble? He had no idea that this would be the beginning of a downward spiral, one that would unravel his life in ways he couldn't yet imagine. As William stood there, feeling proud of his small prank, he didn't notice the shift in the atmosphere. The royal guard remained still, his face a mask of calm and professionalism. Yet, something in the air had changed. The onlookers, once amused by the situation, fell quiet, sensing that this was not just a harmless joke. The air felt heavier now, like a storm was gathering on the horizon, but William remained unaware of the gravity of his actions. He still believed that it was just another silly moment that would soon pass, like the many pranks he'd pulled in the past. The guard stood unmoving, his posture rigid, but his mind was far from still. Inside, a storm was brewing. He had been taught to never react to provocation, to always maintain his composure no matter the situation. He knew his role and understood the respect he was meant to uphold. The paint on his boots was a small thing, but it was a symbol of disrespect, not just to him, but to the very institution he served. For a moment, there was silence. The crowd had quieted, their eyes fixed on the guard, unsure of what would happen next. William, however, was still chuckling, completely unaware of the growing tension around him. He thought the guard would brush it off, like everyone else did with his jokes. But he was wrong. Without a word, the royal guard turned slightly, his eyes still fixed ahead, but now filled with a quiet determination. William finally noticed that something was different. The guard's face was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of something that told William that this was not going to be as easy to laugh off as he had imagined. The tourist's smile faded as he realized that the guard was not moving, not in the way he had expected. The calm, professional demeanor of the soldier was unsettling. It was clear now that this wasn't something that could be dismissed or ignored. William's heart began to race as the reality of what he had done slowly started to settle in. The guard didn't speak, didn't move, but he didn't need to. The quiet tension in the air spoke volumes. William felt a pit grow in his stomach as he wondered if he had gone too far. He had been quick to laugh earlier, but now, standing in front of the soldier, he felt small and foolish. Just then, two palace officials appeared, moving swiftly and silently through the crowd. Their expressions were stern, and they wasted no time in confronting William. The atmosphere had changed completely. What had been a light-hearted moment just minutes ago had now become a serious situation. The officials made it clear that what William had done was a grave offense, one that could not be ignored. They didn't need to raise their voices. Their presence alone was enough to make William feel the weight of his mistake. William tried to laugh it off, but it felt hollow now. His wealth, his charm, none of it mattered in this moment. The smile that had been on his face was gone, replaced by a growing sense of dread. His once confident and carefree attitude faltered as he realized that this incident was far more serious than he had ever anticipated. The consequences were beginning to unfold, and he had no idea how deep the damage would go. As the palace officials escorted him away, the crowd slowly dispersed, murmuring about what had just happened. William, still in shock, could hardly comprehend what had just occurred. In his mind, it had been a harmless prank, but the world around him had already started to treat it as something far worse. He could feel the weight of the guard's silent disapproval pressing on him, and it filled him with regret. He didn't know yet that his life was about to change forever because of this one foolish mistake. As the palace officials led William away, his mind was spinning. He was still trying to process what had just happened. For a moment, he couldn't believe it. It was just a prank, wasn't it? That was all it was. But now, the seriousness of the situation was sinking in. The officials' stern expressions, the quiet whispers from the crowd, the way the guard stood perfectly still, all of it was making him feel more and more uncomfortable. Walking through the palace courtyard, William's thoughts raced. Why had he done it? It had started as a joke, a way to amuse himself, but now it felt so wrong. His mind flashed back to the moment when he had poured the paint on the guard's boots. The laughter of the tourists around him, the confident feeling of getting away with something. It all seemed so distant now. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had crossed a line, but the question was, how badly? The guard's silence had been the most unsettling part. William had expected a reaction, even if it was just a quick scolding or a disapproving look. But instead, the soldier had remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed ahead as though nothing had happened. It had almost been like the guard was waiting for something, waiting for the right moment to respond. And now, with the officials guiding William away, it felt like that moment had arrived. In the cool stone corridors of the palace, William found himself standing in front of a grand door, one that seemed to hold a weight he couldn't understand. He was told to wait by one of the officials. For the first time since his arrival, William felt truly small, like a child caught doing something wrong. He could feel his heart racing, and his palms began to sweat. He had spent his whole life being in control, whether it was his business deals, his travels, or his social status. But now, all of that seemed irrelevant. Nothing in his life had prepared him for this. As he stood there, waiting for someone to speak to him, he couldn't help but think about the guard. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how deeply the prank had affected him. William had seen the guard as nothing more than a part of the tourist attraction, a figure to be admired for his uniform and stillness. But the reality was so much deeper. The guard wasn't just standing there for show. He had a purpose, a duty to his country, to his people, and to the history that he represented. The more William thought about it, the more he understood that his actions had been more than just disrespectful. They had been an attack on everything the guard stood for. Minutes passed, and the palace seemed eerily quiet. The walls, decorated with centuries of history, seemed to stare down at him, reminding him of his mistake. William's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the door opening. Two more officials entered, and this time, their faces were even more serious. One of them was carrying a scroll, which he handed to William without a word. The scroll was a formal notice of what William had done and the charges he was now facing. The reality hit him hard. He could barely comprehend what the document said. His actions had consequences far beyond anything he had imagined. It wasn't just the guard who had been insulted, but the entire nation, the monarchy, and the centuries-old traditions that had shaped the country. William's face turned pale as he read the words. He had made a mistake, a big one, and now there would be consequences. As the officials explained the next steps to him, William felt trapped, like there was no way out. The feeling of arrogance that had filled him earlier was now replaced by a deep sense of regret. He had thought he was above the rules, that his wealth could protect him from anything. But now, he was learning the hard way that respect was something money couldn't buy, and there were lines that even the richest couldn't cross. William sat in the palace, the weight of the situation finally sinking in. He had been escorted to a room, surrounded by quiet, stern faces. He tried to keep his composure, but inside, he felt like his world was crumbling around him. He had been through many tough situations in his life, but nothing compared to this. The feeling of being completely powerless, of having no control over what was happening, was something he wasn't used to. The room was filled with silence, broken only by the occasional shuffle of papers. He could hear the faint sounds of people outside, but they felt so far away. His thoughts raced. What was going to happen to him? He had always been confident that his wealth could solve any problem, that he could buy his way out of anything. But now, standing here, he realized how wrong he had been. The consequences of his actions were far beyond his understanding. An official entered the room, his face expressionless. He carried a formal document, the same one that William had read earlier. This time, it was more serious. There was no way out of this. The document explained the charges in more detail, but the words didn't seem to register with William. The royal guard's dignity had been violated, and now the royal family, the monarchy, and the people of the country were all involved. William had no idea just how far this would reach. The official explained that there would be a formal investigation into his actions. William's heart sank as he realized that the repercussions were more than just a simple apology or fine. His actions had sparked something much larger, something that no amount of money could fix. He had offended the entire nation, and there was no easy way to make up for it. He was informed that he would be banned from visiting the palace and that his name would be reported in the media. His reputation would be tarnished, and it would be nearly impossible to undo the damage. The wealth that had always shielded him from any negative consequences now felt like a distant memory. In that moment, William understood that he had made a mistake that could not be erased. The official's words echoed in his mind as he processed what was happening. There would be no simple way out of this mess. It wasn't about paying a fine or apologizing to the guard. It was about something much deeper. His disrespect for the guard was seen as an insult to the nation's pride, to its history and traditions. There was no amount of money that could fix that. As the official left the room, William was left alone with his thoughts. He couldn't shake the image of the royal guard's still face, the quiet dignity with which he had endured the prank. The more William thought about it, the more he realized just how foolish he had been. The guard's actions had spoken louder than any words could have. He had shown restraint, honor, and respect. while William had acted impulsively, thinking he could do whatever he wanted without consequence. The silence in the room felt suffocating now. William's mind kept replaying the events over and over. How had it all gone so wrong? He had come here with the intention of having fun, to enjoy his vacation, to be the center of attention. But now, everything had turned upside down. His wealth, his power, and his status had all become meaningless. What he had done was bigger than money. It was about respect, and he had lost that in an instant. He sat there, feeling the sting of regret more deeply than he had ever felt before. It was too late to undo his actions, and the consequences had already started to unfold. He had no idea how much this one mistake would change his life, but deep down, he knew that things would never be the same again. The days that followed were some of the hardest in William's life. The media was quick to pick up the story, and soon, every newspaper and social media platform was buzzing with news of the incident. What had seemed like a harmless prank to him was now the subject of intense public scrutiny. His actions, once dismissed as a joke, had sparked outrage, and the public's reaction was far harsher than he had ever imagined. He watched as the news spread, not just in his own country, but internationally. His face was splashed across the front pages of newspapers, his name trending on social media. The headlines were unforgiving. Wealthy tourist disrespects royal guard. Foreign tourists' joke turns into national scandal, and prank gone wrong. A moment of arrogance that cost him everything. The words stung as William read them, each one a reminder of his mistake. He had always been used to the spotlight, but this was a different kind of attention. The rich and famous were often the subject of gossip, but this was different. This wasn't just about a rich man having fun. It was about disrespecting something sacred, something that the people of the country held dear. The royal guard was more than just a soldier to them. He was a symbol of honor, duty, and tradition. To mock that was to insult the very essence of their identity. William tried to defend himself, offering an apology to the media and his followers. He explained that it had been a silly mistake, a moment of carelessness, but no one seemed to believe him. His wealth and status, which had always been his shield, now felt like they were working against him. People didn't want to hear excuses. They wanted accountability. They wanted to see that he understood the gravity of what he had done. And no matter how many times he apologized, it never felt like enough. The public backlash was relentless. His social media accounts were flooded with angry comments, some of them harsh and unforgiving. People were calling him names, mocking his behavior, and demanding consequences for his actions. They couldn't understand how someone who had everything could be so thoughtless, so disrespectful. William's wealth, his status, his ability to move through life effortlessly, it all seemed irrelevant now. People didn't care about his success or his high society connections. They only cared about the fact that he had disrespected something that was important to them. Even in his personal life, things started to fall apart. Business deals he had lined up were suddenly canceled. Invitations to exclusive events and social gatherings were rescinded. People who had once been eager to spend time with him now kept their distance, unwilling to associate with someone who had so thoroughly embarrassed himself. William found himself alone, isolated from the world he had once dominated. His life, once filled with luxury and ease, was now marked by a deep sense of regret and shame. The more he tried to fix things, the worse it seemed to get. His apologies seemed hollow to the public, and his reputation continued to spiral downward. He had become a symbol of arrogance and entitlement, and no amount of money or charm could erase the damage. His name was forever linked with that moment, the moment he had poured paint on the royal guard, thinking it was just a harmless prank. As he sat alone in his hotel room one evening, staring at his phone, and the endless stream of negative comments, he realized how far he had fallen. It wasn't just his reputation that had been destroyed. It was his understanding of respect and humility. For the first time in his life, he truly saw the consequences of his actions. The money he had relied on, the power he had always wielded, none of it mattered now. What mattered was that he had lost something far more valuable: the respect of the people around him. As the days turned into weeks, William found himself drowning in regret. The once lavish and carefree life he had known now seemed like a distant memory. His wealth no longer felt like a cushion, and the life of luxury that had defined him seemed pointless. Everywhere he went, he was met with whispers, judgmental looks, and the constant reminder of his mistake. He had been a man who thought he was untouchable, someone who could move through life without ever facing real consequences. But now he was painfully aware of how wrong he had been. The apology he had issued to the public didn't seem to make any difference. In fact, it only seemed to make things worse. His words, though sincere, felt empty to those who had been hurt by his actions. The more he tried to explain himself, the more it seemed like the damage was growing. He was no longer the respected figure he had once been. Instead, he was a symbol of arrogance and disrespect. The stories about him were relentless, and no matter where he went, he was confronted with the fallout of his careless behavior. William's business dealings, which had once been the backbone of his success, were now falling apart. The companies and clients he had worked with were distancing themselves from him, unwilling to associate with someone who had caused such a scandal. His reputation had become toxic. No one wanted to be seen with him, and even the friends he thought he could rely on were now avoiding him. Invitations to events, dinners, and social gatherings were no longer extended to him. He felt like an outcast, rejected by the world that had once welcomed him with open arms. At night, as he lay awake in his hotel room, William couldn't escape the feeling of shame that clung to him. He thought back to the moment when he had poured the paint on the Royal Guard's boots. It had seemed so small at the time, just a harmless prank meant to get a laugh. But now, looking back, it was clear that it had been more than that. It was a disrespectful act, one that had crossed a line he hadn't even known existed. And the worst part was that he hadn't fully understood what that line meant until it was too late. The public outrage had been overwhelming. He could feel it everywhere, in every conversation, in every comment on social media. People had called him arrogant, entitled, and thoughtless. They had criticized him for being out of touch with the world, for not understanding the importance of respect. And he realized, painfully, that they were right. He had taken everything for granted: the privileges of his wealth, the admiration he received from others, the life that seemed to open doors for him at every turn. But now, all of that had come crashing down. As he sat in his room, surrounded by the silence of his own mistakes, William began to understand the true cost of his actions. It wasn't just about the paint, the Royal Guard, or the palace. It was about the way he had lived his life, believing that he was above the rules, that his wealth and status gave him the right to act however he wanted without facing the consequences. The guard's silent dignity, the way he had stood tall in the face of disrespect, had shown William something that he had never truly understood before: that respect could never be bought, and that it was earned through actions, not status. William felt a deep sense of regret. He had been given everything, yet he had thrown it all away for the sake of a joke. Now his life was in ruins, and he had no idea how to rebuild it. All he could do was reflect on the mistakes he had made and hope that, in time, he might learn the value of humility and respect. As the days continued to pass, William knew he had to try something to make amends, though he had no idea where to begin. The damage to his reputation had been done, and no matter how many apologies he issued, it seemed as though they fell on deaf ears. He could feel the weight of the public's judgment pressing on him. But this time, he realized that apologizing wasn't going to be enough. He needed to do something that showed he truly understood the gravity of his mistake. He had always been a man who believed that money and status could solve any problem. But now, he understood that the rules were different in this situation. The people of the country weren't angry because he was wealthy. They were angry because he had disrespected something they valued deeply. They had expected him to act with respect and humility, but instead, he had acted out of arrogance and carelessness. After days of reflection, William decided that he would go to the palace and apologize to the royal guard in person. He knew it wouldn't be easy. The guard, who had remained silent and dignified throughout the incident, had been the target of his prank, and William couldn't just brush it aside with a simple apology. He needed to face the man, look him in the eyes, and truly express his regret for what he had done. The idea of facing the guard was daunting, but William realized that it was the only way to show that he understood the depth of his actions. He made his way to the palace once again, this time with a different mindset. There were no cameras, no reporters, just the chance to make things right, even if only in a small way. When he arrived at the palace, the same officials who had escorted him out before were waiting for him. They didn't greet him with the same coldness they had earlier, but the tension in the air was still palpable. William could feel his heart pounding in his chest as he was led through the same corridors, now familiar in a way he wished they weren't. He knew the situation was delicate, but he had made up his mind. This was the only way forward. Finally, they'd reached the guard's post. The royal guard was standing still, just as he had before, his posture straight and unyielding. William stood in front of him, his voice slightly trembling as he spoke. "I owe you an apology," he began, his words soft but sincere. "I disrespected you, and I was wrong. I thought I could make a joke, but I didn't understand what it meant to you, to your duty, and to the people here." The guard didn't say anything at first. He simply stood there, eyes forward. But for the first time, William felt like he had the man's attention. He took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. "I've had time to think, and I realize now that what I did was more than a joke. It was an insult, and I'm truly sorry for that. I hope you can find it in yourself to understand that I wasn't thinking, but I know that doesn't change what happened." There was a long pause. William waited, his heart racing, unsure of how the guard would respond. He had come to understand that forgiveness wasn't something that could be demanded. It had to be earned, and even then, it wasn't guaranteed. The guard had every right to reject his apology, but William knew he had to offer it anyway. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the guard turned his head slightly, just enough to acknowledge William's presence. He didn't speak, but the silence wasn't hostile. It was the kind of silence that came with understanding, perhaps not of complete forgiveness, but of recognition that William had taken responsibility for his actions. It wasn't much, but it was enough for William to know that he had done the right thing by coming here, by facing the man he had wronged. As William turned to leave, he felt a small sense of relief. It wasn't a complete fix, and he knew that rebuilding his reputation would take time. But this moment of honesty, of trying to make things right, felt like a small step toward redemption. He realized that it wasn't about expecting instant forgiveness or approval. It was about showing genuine remorse and learning from his mistakes. Weeks went by, and William found himself in a very different place than he had ever imagined. The apology to the royal guard, though sincere, hadn't fixed everything. His life was still far from what it had been, but as the days passed, he began to see things differently. The weight of his mistake was still there, but it wasn't crushing him like it had before. He had learned something important in the past few weeks, a lesson that would stay with him forever. It wasn't just about the apology or the public's opinion. It was about his personal growth and the realization that respect could never be taken for granted. Despite the public's ongoing judgment, William started to take small steps toward changing the way he approached life. He reached out to some of the businesses he had worked with before the scandal, not to fix the past, but to make sure he treated everyone with the same respect he had failed to show before. Slowly, some of the doors he thought were closed forever began to open again. People were still wary, but the difference was clear. They could see that he was genuinely trying to make amends. The royal guard, of course, had never sought attention for his actions, and William knew that his silent acknowledgement during the apology had been all the man needed to offer. It wasn't forgiveness or a grand gesture, but it was enough for William to know that he had made the first step. The guard's dignity and strength had taught him something he couldn't ignore: the importance of humility. For the first time in a long while, William found himself stepping back from the world he had once dominated with wealth and status. He began to appreciate the quiet moments of reflection. Instead of trying to buy his way out of trouble or seeking out constant admiration, he began to learn the value of humility and responsibility. His journey wasn't about regaining his former position in society. It was about becoming a better person. Though life had changed dramatically for him, William's outlook began to shift. He no longer viewed challenges as obstacles to overcome with money or power. He saw them as opportunities to grow, to prove that he was more than just the sum of his wealth. It was a hard lesson to learn, but it was one he would carry with him. One day, as he walked through the city, he passed the same place where he had poured paint on the royal guard's boots. The memory hit him like a wave, and for a moment, he stopped. There was no crowd now, no media buzzing around him, just the quiet streets, the hustle of everyday life, and the peaceful rhythm of a world that had continued moving, even without his presence at the center of it. William felt a deep sense of gratitude for the life he had left. He realized how fleeting everything had been, how easy it was to forget the importance of respect and humility when surrounded by luxury. The lesson wasn't just about his mistake with the guard. It was about the way he had lived before, the way he had taken things for granted. The royal guard, though never fully recognized for his actions, had changed William's life in a way no one else could have. He had taught him that true respect wasn't something that could be demanded. It had to be earned through actions, through humility, and through understanding. William would never forget the silence of that moment, the way the guard had stood without judgment, only dignity. In the end, William knew that redemption wasn't something that came overnight. It was a journey, and it was something that could take years. But as he stood there, taking in the simple beauty of life, he knew that he was on the right path. The mistakes were behind him, and the future, though uncertain, held the promise of something better. A life built not on wealth or status, but on respect, understanding, and the lessons he had learned the hard way.